It in South Africa, as in Brazil or even Britain and in the U.S. as well, political parties resist transparency. They don't want to see. You just mentioned Becky's saying, "Let's deal with this only within the party and not publicly." But you would think that a party with the history and ideology of the ANC, the struggle, so many years fighting apartheid and all that, it would be more open, but it's not really.
It was for a few years under Mandela. The very early years were remarkable in that there was complete transparency. Parliament played a very important role, even though it was dominated by the ANC, in holding the ANC ministers to account. But once Mbeki took over and he became president of the ANC in 1998, things started to change. Things started to close down very much. And this was, I think, a reflection of Thabo Mbeki's own personal political experience, which recall that he spent his life from the age of 16 in exile in various parts of the world. And the ANC in exile, which was faced with this dreadful enemy in apartheid South Africa, who used to, on a fairly regular basis, kill ANC members who were based outside South Africa, as a consequence of which the ANC in exile was very secretive, not really willing to trust anybody they hadn't known for a long time, because its ranks was infiltrated by spies of the apartheid regime. And unfortunately, when Mbeki took over government, this sort of almost paranoia and suspicion of the ANC in exile came with him into government, so that suddenly scrutiny by the media wasn't wanted anymore. So suddenly Parliament became a rubber stamp and would simply endorse any decisions that the ANC leadership took. And it was in that sort of atmosphere that the lack of transparency on the arms deal really manifested itself. And it's been a tragedy for South Africa. But I suppose, to be completely honest with you, what has been so tragic is how South Africa has so quickly, after democracy in 1994, adopted politics as usual, as they're practiced in most parts of the world today. Because for a few years we were different, we were exceptional. Then it became politics as normal.
But don't you think that tends to happen with the liberation movements that come into power? We had so many recent examples, a lot of them in Africa, of course, but not just Africa. If you take Central America, the Sandinistas, when they came to power, corruption took over. And in Africa, we have Zimbabwe, we have the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique.
Yeah.
Do you think this is an inevitable result? Liberation movements with all the ideology, all the purity, so-called, and then they come to power and everything goes. Is that inevitable?
I don't think it has to be inevitable. I think, as you suggest, that history suggests to us that it is highly likely, but it does not need to be inevitable. And the reason, I think, the big bulwark against it, I would suggest, is an active citizenry. Is people, even people who were active participants in these liberation movements, remaining on their toes and keeping the leaders, now the government leaders, accountable. And the way in which leadership, certainly in the South African context, attempts to deal with it is by drawing these people into the circle of patronage, so that the people who are politically close to them or could be politically difficult for them are given material rewards to act as a disincentive to hold the government to account. But another point that I would like to make is that we mustn't forget, we're talking about the corrupted, we mustn't forget the corruptors. And the reality in the case of many so-called developing countries or emerging economies is that, the big arms companies, for instance, who are at the forefront of corruption, which, as you correctly say, Transparency International have said that the arms industry accounts for over 40% of all corruption in all global trade. These people target developing country governments, many of whom have been led by liberation movements, whose leaders haven't had access to much material wealth previously, and they consciously target them and offer all sorts of rewards and incentives. So I think there needs to be vigilance in these countries themselves, but at the same time we need to look at those who are undertaking the corruption. Another very important aspect in the South African equation was the need for these liberation movements, once they become political parties, for funding, for political party funding. And in South Africa, nobody knows where political parties get their funds from. It is not public knowledge. And I think that that is crucial. I believe that every dollar that goes to a political party should be public knowledge, because those parties exist to serve the electorate. So the electorate have the right to know where they're getting their money from, and therefore knowing what is informing the decisions they take.
Another question that has a link with South Africa and it calls attention worldwide is Zimbabwe. Yeah. The policy that Mbeki maintained in relation to Robert Mugabe was the so-called silent diplomacy. When the whole world is being scandalized by what's been happening in Zimbabwe, Mbeki, the only one had some influence there, carried out this silent diplomacy that was so silent it was dead. Nothing ever happened. Is Zuma going to be any different?
As he was competing with Mbeki for the presidency of the ANC, he was far more critical of Mugabe and of Mbeki's policies towards him. Once he had won the ANC presidency, he moderated his language, and he seemed to move back into a sort of Mbeki-type position of quiet diplomacy, as you say. So at the moment, there are no indications that he's going to be any tougher on Mugabe. I think what he is going to do is the government of national unity that now exists in Zimbabwe, he's going to want to see that work. But I'm not sure that he is going to put any more pressure on Mugabe than Mbeki did to ensure it works. And that's what worries me. You know, it's very interesting. People do forget that he was, one, a very successful liberation leader, but two, in the early years of democracy in Zimbabwe, he was very well regarded as a leader. His economic policies were judicious and successful. There was a lot of racial reconciliation in the country. And where things started to go badly wrong is when his hold on power was threatened by the opposition. And then we started to see the seizure of land for his own cronies to keep them on side. And we saw this almost kleptocracy where the Treasury, the Reserve Bank, was used as his personal piggy bank. And human rights were violated across the board in the country, and it was all about him holding on to power. Unfortunately, a fairly similar story, as you say, with liberation movements.
Again, dealing with that quiet diplomacy, another area where it's applied is in Sudan, Darfur. Again, it's a place where South Africa has some influence. Yeah. Again, quiet diplomacy with Mbeki. Are we going to have the same quiet diplomacy with Zuma there as well, as much as in Zimbabwe? Yeah.
My concern with regard to Zuma and foreign policy is that he has appointed somebody who is regarded as a political lightweight as his foreign minister, which immediately suggests that it's not going to be a priority of his. So I don't think we're going to see much change. There is something else that indicates that we're unlikely to see much change. South Africa had a temporary seat on the United Nations Security Council, during which time we not only protected Zimbabwe in the Security Council, but we also protected the military regime of Burma, which was unconscionable given our own history. And there was hope at one point that Zuma would be different, that he would revert to a more moral stance on foreign policy. But quite soon after he took over the ANC, the Dalai Lama was due to visit South Africa as part of a peace conference linked to the 2010 Football World Cup, Soccer World Cup. The South African government refused him a visa. Now, the reason they did that was because of pressure from China. But it again showed me that moral issues are not going to take the lead in foreign policy, that we are likely to see business as usual. And I think that's tragic, given South Africa's own recent history.
When we think of the policy that, at least Mbeki maintained in that area, Zimbabwe, the cases you just mentioned, Darfur, why was Mandela quiet about that? He was not in power, we know that, but his voice carries so much weight.
Yes.
Why didn't he say something?
I think for two primary reasons. I think Mandela wanted to first of all set an example by standing down voluntarily after only one term in government. He wanted to set a precedent for South Africa. That was the first, and I think part of that was he took a conscious decision not to get involved in issues of governance once he had left office. Eventually it got to the point on AIDS where he did speak out, but you could see that he was incredibly uncomfortable doing so, and it led to the collapse of the relationship between Thabo Mbeki, his successor, and Mandela. So I think there was quite a conscious decision there on the one hand. Then on the other hand, I think one has to just take cognizance of the fact that Mandela is a very old man. And that he has become very frail. His short-term memory is certainly not what it was. And he hasn't actively engaged in politics for many years now. So I think a combination of those two factors probably accounts for why he didn't speak out. Now, the second one of those is quite understandable. The first one, I mean, it is a debatable point whether that was the right approach for him to take, because his successor made many very worrying mistakes.
Do you think that when he died, as you said, he's 90, very frail, yes, the ANC, having lost that reference, historical, everything that Mandela represents, will become even more intolerant and move towards grabbing more power and being less concerned about its past that is symbolized by Mandela?
There is no doubt that this extraordinary moral figure would no longer be there. And yes, this will give people within the ANC, within the public service, within South African society generally, some leeway to think, well, we can maybe do what we want to do. But you also have to understand that Mandela has not been a significant factor in South African political life for many years now. After the fallout with Mbeki, he was really ostracized within the ANC, as I recount in the book. And he hasn't had much impact, which is why I think we've seen such a precipitous moral decline in the ANC. And I think, yes, once Mandela goes, that might even intensify a little further.
Winnie Mandela, whatever happened to her? This is a very mysterious and contradictory figure. You call her in the book the most enigmatic of South Africa's political legends. She's been accused of misusing political funds. She spoke in favor of burning informers in the old days. What happened to her? Who is the real Winnie Mandela?
I think the real Winnie Mandela is someone who, for many years of her life, was incredibly courageous, incredibly brave, played a very important role in the liberation struggle. Yes, had her aberrations, the call for people to be what we called necklaced, which is a tire placed around their neck, petrol on the tire would be set alight, which was then heavily criticized by other ANC leaders. But she's always had this tendency. Once we were in government, there were all sorts of problems. I mean, when I was on that Public Accounts Committee, we had to look at instances when she traveled overseas against the express instructions of the president, her former husband, Nelson Mandela. We had another case of where she had kept ministerial cars and drivers even after she was no longer a deputy minister, and had crashed those cars and would take no responsibility for it. I used to sit just behind her in Parliament, and she wouldn't be there that often. But interestingly, when she was there, this is a person of enormous personal magnetism and charisma. But she was then, I think she was badly tarnished by being found guilty of playing a role in the abducting of a very young activist who was later found dead. And then, as you mentioned, she was also found guilty of fraud, where she was misusing money that was meant for the ANC's Women's League, of which she was then the president. So that has tarnished her reputation. But interestingly, at the ANC's recent drawing up of electoral lists, Winnie Mandela, suddenly, like a phoenix from the ashes, was, I think, one of the 5 most popular ANC leaders again, having been in the political wilderness for a number of years. And that has happened to a number of controversial figures. And I think this is perhaps emblematic of Zuma and those he carries with him, that they are people often with quite tarnished histories, often with involvement in corruption, in slightly dubious activities. And this is why there is apprehension about his stewardship of South Africa.
The white people in South Africa, since the ANC came to power in '94, statistics show that 800,000 whites have left the country, taking their skills with them, which is more serious. A few probably left, obviously, because they're racist. They couldn't stand the idea of blacks in power and all that. But 800,000, that's quite too many. Why did they leave?
White South Africans have been leaving the country for generations and generations. Quite a few left during the apartheid years because they couldn't stomach what was being done in their name. Some left for purely economic reasons in those days. They wanted to have economic opportunities that weren't as restricted as those in South Africa. Many left just before the 1994 election, thinking that the ANC coming to power was going to be some sort of cataclysm. And people have consistently left since then. I think one of the driving factors in these departures has been the very high levels of violent crime. South Africa experiences 55 murders a day. And I think many people who have the material means to leave feel that they might be safer elsewhere. That's one reason. Secondly, as you say, I think there are some who leave because they can't countenance a black African government. And I think that's deeply embedded racism, unfortunately. But I do think there are a lot of South Africans who leave to seek economic opportunities. And I do think that the flow of people from South Africa is quite a fluid one.
A lot come back?
A lot come back, and you see especially younger people leaving now because they have the ability to come and spend 2 years in the United Kingdom, for instance, where they gain very valuable work experience, and then a lot of those people go back. And the other quite interesting factor is that it's not just whites leaving anymore. There are quite a lot of black South Africans who leave now because they want experience of a wider world. So I think part of it is just South Africa opening up to the world. Part of it is the unfortunate reality of the very high levels of violent crime. And part of it is the seeking of economic opportunities. I do think, interestingly, that as the world goes through far more difficult economic times, quite a lot of South Africans with skills who left to seek economic opportunities are seriously considering returning.
As part of the transition, of course, it would be expected that there would be programs to try to benefit the black community that suffers so many years from discrimination. So there is this black empowerment program that aims to do exactly that. You benefit the blacks who didn't get enough education, didn't get enough opportunities, until a point where things will be leveled out. An affirmative action program like the Americans have, and it's reverse discrimination, as they call it here in Britain. But there's a lot of criticism of that as well. As usual, people are taking advantage of it, aren't they?
Absolutely. The need for this affirmative action program is, in my mind, unequivocal. One has to make up these hundreds of years of imbalance in education, in access to opportunities, in access to wealth. Unfortunately, rather than making this a very broad-based program that drew in especially those black South Africans who most needed it, the poorest. And that's a quarter of South African society. What has happened is it's become dependent on political patronage. So the people who've benefited most from it were those people who were closest to Thabo Mbeki and his leadership clique. So it became a very narrow concept. It became something to advantage those who were supporting the right people politically. And even if you were an ANC person but were not in the Mbeki grouping, you were unlikely to benefit from it. So it has only affected a very small minority of black South Africans. It hasn't had the broad, pervasive effect that it needs to have in the society. And obviously the concern is now, with a change of the guard within the ANC, it will simply be to the benefit of those people around Jacob Zuma who were left out under Thabo Mbeki.
Time for these people to fill their bellies.
Exactly. But what is really needed is for a far more broad-based empowerment program that advantages people regardless of their political or personal political affiliations.
The question of aid to Africa, as you know, it's become a controversial issue because as much as traditionally people ask for aid for Africa, campaigns for that, a recent book brought out this issue as the fact that aid for Africa has only damaged the African. It's a bad policy. We shouldn't have aid for Africa. What's your view on that?
I don't buy that. I think that some of the aid, depending on how it's been targeted and how it's been given, has been absolutely crucial. For instance, in keeping millions of Africans alive during the AIDS pandemic. I think that perhaps what has been focused on too much is the aid that has been utilized corruptly, that has found its way into private pockets. And a lot of that is due to the way in which this aid is dispensed. For instance, there are great links between the ways in which aid is dispensed in Africa and arms deals. So that Western countries often give money, but it's then money that has to be used to buy, for instance, arms and weapons from those same governments who gave that money. In addition to which, at the same time that aid is being given, and there is all sorts of talk about the importance for good governance, for overcoming corruption, etc., etc., those same governments giving the aid have been acting as salesmen for their arms companies and other companies, their oil companies, their other extractive industry companies, perpetuating the very corruption that they're speaking out about. So I think that where aid has gone wrong, and of course there have been massive problems with aspects of aid, I think that the giving countries are in some ways as culpable as the receiving countries. And I believe that in that lies part of the solution to Africa's woes. Africa does have to take responsibility. Citizens of African countries have to themselves get rid of corrupt leaders. But at the same time, we have to expose and be very critical of the corruption that is coming from Western countries in the guise of helping African countries to help themselves.